Suppose there is a couple, the Joneses, who just gave birth to a baby boy named Sammy. As they stand together in the hospital gazing down at their newborn, they share an awareness that the life ahead of Sammy will be filled with an indeterminable amount of both pleasure and suffering, happiness and heartbreak, miracle and tragedy. Then in an instant, the harsh reality of their baby's future hits them, and for a fleeting second, they look into each other's eyes and think, if we hadn't given birth to him in the first place, he wouldn't suffer anything. Right there, they both make the decision to give Sammy the best life they can, and to prevent him from experiencing as much suffering as is humanly possible. The Joneses are great parents for thinking this, but in the words of David Benatar, it is curious that while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is to not bring those children into existence in the first place. This is the philosophy of anti-natalism. It's the thought that human procreation is unethical, the belief that any action with suffering as its byproduct should not be encouraged, no matter how much pleasure will follow as well. Although the roots of anti-natalism can be traced all the way back to ancient Greece, the philosophy has experienced a particular spike in popularity over the last decade or so. This recent resurgence can be accredited, by and large, to the South African philosopher David Benatar, who authored what may be the most widely known literature on the subject. In his book Better Never to Have Been, Benatar argues that his anti-natalist views come from a place of compassion, stating that the only way to truly prevent the suffering that comes with existence is to not exist in the first place. And he isn't the first person to have this thought. The Greek tragedian Sophocles once said, "Never to have been born is best." Heinrich Heine, the 19th century German poet, wrote, "Sleep is good, death is better, but of course, the best thing would have been to never have been born at all." And the preacher in Ecclesiastes said, "So I have praised the dead that are already dead more than the living that are yet alive. But better than both of them is he who has not yet been, who has not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." So as you can see, the school of thought that non-existence is inherently better than existence isn't a new one. In recent years, though, these ideas have given rise to the anti-natalist belief that seeks to end human procreation. There are two different schools of thought under the anti-natalistic argument. The first is the one David Benatar makes when he says we should spare the unborn from suffering that is life. This argument centers around the harm in which existence poses on the baby being born. On the other hand of the spectrum are the misanthropic arguments for anti-natalism that center more around the harm that babies being born will go on to inflict upon one another, other animals, and the environment as a whole. To put it into context, consider this. The average carbon footprint for a single person in the United States has been estimated to be around 16 to 20 tons per year, meaning that just fulfilling daily necessities such as driving, showering, eating, and using electricity has unimaginably damaging consequences towards the environment we live in. So to anti-natalists, the most ethical way to solve this problem is to prevent it from happening in the first place. Both anti-natalist arguments, whether philanthropic or misanthropic, are centered around one core problem, suffering, and one proposed solution, to stop giving birth. And you might say, well, what about all the good things in life? Why would you not want a child to experience all of that? Well, anti-natalists believe that in human life, there is an inherent imbalance, or asymmetry, between pleasure and suffering. Let's take Sammy, for instance. Because Sammy has been born, he would experience pain, which is bad, and pleasure, which is good. However, if Sammy was never born, then he would never experience pain, which is good, and he also wouldn't experience pleasure, which is not bad. The argument therefore is that the presence of pain will always be objectively more harmful than the absence of pleasure, and so it makes sense to preserve the absence of pleasure rather than introduce the presence of pain. Everyone suffers from being human, but no one suffers from not existing in the first place. A second argument that the followers of anti-natalists bring forward is the hypothetical consent argument, which states that no one can consent to being born. Consent is simply defined as the act of giving permission for something to happen, and according to the anti-natalist hypothetical consent argument, the unborn cannot give permission to being brought into the world, and so, as a result, the act of procreation should be seen as non-consensual, and therefore unethical. If we're focusing solely on the information we have about pre-birth that is scientifically provable, then the hypothetical consent argument is pretty difficult to argue against. But of course, as we know, the full extent of our pre-birth experience isn't yet known by scientists, or even anyone for that matter.
I am a psychologist, and I know that there are depths of the mind that have remained untapped for most of us in our normal business of going about our affairs.
This uncertainty opens up the door for a wide array of pseudoscientists who seek to explore the nature of our pre-birth experience using methods which, although can't be definitely proven by science, still add some thought-provoking counterclaims that are worth considering. One of those pseudoscientists is Helen Wambach, who hypnotized 750 subjects in the 1970s and asked them the question, "Did you choose to be born?" The responses she aggregated were quite staggering. 81% of Wambach's subjects reported that they did choose to be born, while 19% reported that they were either unaware of the choice or they got no clear answer to that question. Of course, again, research and findings gathered from hypnosis can't be scientifically proven. But in the face of the seemingly unknowable, studies like this pose at least some perspective that should not be disregarded entirely. However, focusing back on the data that we do have definitive answers to, consider the story of Gold Mana, written by Sienna Schifrin, which is used by anti-natalists as an example for the hypothetical consent argument. Gold Mana is a wealthy man who lives on an island and decides one day, for reasons unknown, that he wants to donate some of his wealth to his neighbors on an adjacent island. These neighbors are comfortably off, but would still objectively benefit from his donation. Unfortunately though, due to historical tension between the governments of these neighboring islands, Gold Mana and his agents aren't able to physically go to the adjacent island, nor are they permitted by law to even communicate with the people living there. But still determined to donate, he handcrafts several heavy cubes of gold, each worth $5 million. Then he flies his plane over the neighboring island and drops the cubes down to the civilians underneath. He tries to avoid hitting people with the cubes, knowing that it could cause injury, but eventually after gifting several people with the wealth, he hits one person, who the story aptly names Unlucky. The impact of the cube breaks Unlucky's arm, yet at the same time grants them $5 million. Schifrin acknowledges that, on the one hand, with all the elements of the story considered, Unlucky was an overall beneficiary of Gold Mana's actions, as the $5 million that they received is enough to cover the cost of the broken arm and then some. Yet on the other hand, Schifrin argues that an objective wrong was still committed by Gold Mana, since the harm he inflicted on the Unlucky wasn't consensual, despite how much the payout might have outweighed the harm. Unlucky was living a decent life before Gold Mana came into the picture. His life wasn't pleasurable, but he didn't suffer any pain either. After the cube dropped on his arm, he experienced both pain and pleasure. In light of all this, we have to ask the question, which then is better? To have experienced pain and pleasure, or not any at all? I think to answer that, we have to define what pain, or in this case, suffering, is. For millennia, philosophers have traveled to great depths to dissect what this experience really means, and why it corresponds so closely with human life. One of those philosophers was Fyodor Dostoevsky, the infamous Russian novelist whose work contemplates the spiritual dimensions of human psychology in extraordinary depth, and who invented the genre of existentialist literature. Dostoevsky's final book, The Brothers Karamazov, tells the story of three brothers, Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha, whose opposing spiritual and world views are forced into question when they are tasked with solving their father's murder. The novel's most theatrical ideological clash occurs between Ivan, the middle son who is broken away from his religious family in pursuit of a more Western and rationalist education, and Alyosha, his spirited younger brother who has chosen to remain attached to his family's faith. Ivan claims that due to the existence of suffering, and more specifically the suffering of innocent children, to believe in the omniscience of God and the goodness of people is illogical, impossible, and impermissible. He laments, "Listen, if everyone must suffer in order to buy eternal harmony, pray tell me what children have got to do with it. It's quite incomprehensible why they should have to suffer." Through the character of Ivan, Dostoevsky paints a clear picture of a man whose compassionate intellectualism supersedes his faith in humanity so far to the point where he rejects the idea of human life altogether. Sound familiar? Several parallels can be drawn between Dostoevsky's Ivan and Benatar's anti-natalism, as both believe that if suffering is so synonymous with human life, then non-existence is the better alternative. This argument Ivan poses is more broadly referred to as the problem of evil, and it is one of the most ancient and compelling defenses against the belief of God that exists in philosophical literature to date. The argument's possible origins have been traced back to Epicurus, an ancient Greek sage, who famously asked, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he isn't omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil?" The last question, whence comes evil, or in other words, where does evil come from, is yet another heavily debated subject which is, of course, ultimately unanswerable. However, antinatalists would likely argue that whatever origin or meaning suffering may carry matters little, as it is irrelevant in the face of suffering's devastation. And in a sense, I completely agree, as searching for meaning to assign to suffering can so easily become a slippery slope which leads people to excuse, disregard, or gloss over the objective reality of both their own suffering and the suffering of others. Yet, at the same time, the practice of assigning meaning to suffering can also be a powerful coping mechanism, which can transform the internal world of a person who is tasked to live with its heavy burdens. The answer, like most things, possibly lies somewhere in the middle of these two extremes, and differs from person to person. In a way, both anti-natalist philosophies and the ideas of Dostoevsky's Ivan challenge us to come to terms with the reality of human suffering. Every day we're faced with things in our existence that are so factually unanswerable to the point that they can only be addressed through the lens of hypotheticals or faith. However, suffering, unlike these elusive, unanswerable existential questions, is very much real, tangible, devastating, overwhelming, and ever-present. You turn on the TV and hear one bad news story after the other. You go online and you're reading stories of corruption, human rights violations, and wars all around the globe. With humanity's suffering even more prominent now that we have access to world news at our fingertips, it's no wonder then that arguments for anti-natalism are becoming more and more compelling and seeing a rise culturally. In the end, we're faced with one question. In the face of all that we know to be concretely true about the reality of suffering, should you choose to believe that human life isn't worth creating, or that it would have been better if you hadn't been born? Or do you choose to still have faith in that intangible sliver of hope that there is some larger reason for your coming to this earth in the first place, despite the suffering that your existence entails? No matter which side of the fence you stand on, I think it's important to acknowledge questions of this nature, questions of faith. It's because our attitudes towards and surrounding all that is unanswerable about our existence ultimately forms the philosophical bedrock of how we view the world and how we'll go on to act in our lives. Although Alyosha, Ivan's faithful younger brother, doesn't pose a very compelling counter-argument to Ivan's laments during their famous fight that I mentioned earlier, the subsequent actions he takes throughout the rest of the novel go on to demonstrate Dostoevsky's final illustration of how one should conduct themselves even in the face of suffering and in relation to the problem of evil. Alyosha's direction has him working on the ground, directly with the impoverished schoolchildren of his community, doing the tedious work of actually making their day-to-day lives more enjoyable and infusing their lives with a sense of meaning. Alyosha becomes an active participant, helping out in every instance of suffering he encounters. This is made particularly clear through his mentorship of a young impoverished boy, whose suicide Alyosha prevents with his compassion. Meanwhile, Ivan spends the second half of the story dissolving into a state of delirium after realizing that his intellectual arguments against human life led to the murder of his own father, as they gave another man the confidence to abandon his faith and carry out an act of evil in the world. Dostoevsky's final message was that ultimately, the actions we take in the face of suffering matter more than the intellectual beliefs we hold and preach to others about the nature of suffering. To me, whether or not one chooses to believe that human procreation is ethical matters less than the quality of the subsequent actions which that belief system guides them to take in the world. Like the Joneses, would you be aware of the harsh reality of human suffering and prepare yourself to do everything in your power to protect the ones you love from it? Or will you simply throw your hands in the air and say, I didn't choose to be here anyways, so I don't care what happens? In the end, one should only feel confident holding beliefs against procreation after they can assess whether or not these beliefs can serve them with an effective means of coping with, and helping others to cope with, the suffering directly within and around them. Because, again, whether we realize it or not, our beliefs about the nature of existence hold great power over who we are and how we act in the world. As Dostoevsky's final novel boldly states, is the only meaningful resource we have to combat the reality of suffering that comes with our existence.
Consciousness. It's our awareness, our understanding, our ignorance. Our daily consciousness leaves out more than it takes in. And due to this, it leaves out important things. Things that would help relieve us if we knew them. If we had a higher awareness, a better consciousness, we would feel better. We would be more at peace with things. The deep down truth of things is screened by our consciousness. Our sensory organs will pick things out. Our eyes can only see certain things, our ears can only hear certain things. We have to create instruments and other tools to see things we as humans cannot, to expand our understanding and thus our ego, or consciousness. Humans evolved and became the dominant species on Earth by a long shot. It's due to our innate ability to network with each other. If humanity was wiped out and restarted, like loading an old save file, communities would still form. Structures within society are inevitable due to the variety of brains. Some are good at critical thinking, others are more artistic. However, we are all wired with some innate features. Just as humans form societies that evolve, other creatures do as well. But we're different. We are customizable characters, basically. We can kind of mold ourselves into whatever kind of person we want to be. We can't know for certain that animals or any other life on Earth is conscious or can even function in the same way that we do. Let's put it this way. I know that I have my own thoughts and feelings and emotions, but how can I know for certain that you, or anyone else, does? There's no way I can go to your head and see things 100% from your perspective. I can't know what you're thinking, or if you can even think in the first place. To truly understand the universe, to understand and actually experience life, you have to give yourself up. There's no point in sustaining bliss, and being permanently at an all-time high. The life you're living is what you have put yourself into, what ego you've formed, only you don't want to admit it. You want to believe it happened to you. Day to day, you play non-bliss in order to be able to experience bliss. You put yourself into bad situations. You let in the negative experiences in life just to feel some kind of satisfaction when it goes the other way. Self implies other. White implies black. Death implies life. You can feel your existence as fundamental, not as an accident. At the basic level, at the lowest level imaginable, you are the fundamentals of existence. The same thing that makes you is the same thing that makes up everything else. If you can step back from what you believe, if you can step back from what your sensory organs have turned you into, you start to see things for what they actually are. Do you define yourself as a victim of the world, or as the world? Love is only possible due to the lack of self. You give up all your secrets, the walls you've built to keep people at an arm's distance slowly lower, one by one, until you're a completely open book, until all your pages have been read, and the rest of the pages are blank, waiting to be filled with this newfound love. In basketball, or soccer, or football, you're constantly giving the ball to someone else. The point of the game is to have the ball in your hand for the least amount of time, to constantly be passing it to someone else, to shoot it, to get it out of your hands. It keeps the game going, and life is the same way. If you define yourself, you, as only being what your ego is, as the things you do voluntarily, then you're the victim. It's because of some higher power that you were put here when you didn't ask for it. But what about the things you do involuntarily? Do you beat your heart, or does it just happen to you? You do those things, even though you don't know how. Words don't work here. As Alan Watts said, everyone is fundamentally the alternate reality. Not God in a traditional sense, but God in the sense of being the self, the deep down basic whatever there is. And you're all that, only you're pretending you're not. A mind that can ask, who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of all of this? Tends to forget. As I said, your consciousness tends to leave out critical information at times. A consciousness that can view the world and take in sensory information tends to forget what's behind those eyes. A mind that hasn't gone deep enough to find where those questions come from. Because the same place those questions come from is the same place those answers lie. The brain controls everything. In order to go to the extremes of the universe, to places we can only dream of going, we must first dive deep into something that is all inside of us. Take the Big Bang, for example. Now there's hundreds, thousands of theories as to how we came into existence, but let's go with this one. You believe that you are strictly you. Your human body is all that you are and all that you have ever been. You're simply a small speck of dust in a vast sea of galaxies, stars, planets. You're irrelevant. But rolling back the clock, things get smaller. The universe was more compact. The atoms that make you up are building blocks of the universe, of the hot gas clouds that form stars, that allowed solar systems to form, that allowed planets like Earth to form. If you keep rolling back this clock, you were around at the very instant everything came into existence. That is you too. When everything was infinitesimally small, you were there. But we define ourselves as being only us, mere humans walking on a planet that we didn't ask to get put on. But frankly, every one of us somehow made this happen. We just go on and pretend we didn't. It's because of how we define ourselves. Are you the victim, or are you the world? As cringy as it may sound, everyone you meet is just a small packet of the universe. A present, whether they're a pleasant one or not, that was packaged together from billions of years of engineering and architecture on a universal scale. But instead, we define ourselves as something completely separate from it, something not connected whatsoever, which is a foolish view. We tend to search for how the universe came into being, but we're just the universe trying to understand itself. In order to get to that conclusion, we have to reframe our mindset. We're not as different as we all think. Your name is given to you at birth. Your ideas and personality are collected from the world. Scraps, bits and pieces here and there cling to you like a magnet. So what part of you is you? We are all different manifestations of consciousness, but we are all fundamentally the same thing. We all may have different egos, different personalities, but when you step back, drop the ego, we are all connected. View the universe as a forest. Every one of us is a twig, a leaf, a branch. But together, we form life. Our origin, our roots, are connected together. Just as the roots of trees form a vast network which brings these massive forests to life, humanity's roots all come from the same place. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transferred from one form of energy to another. But many of us have this fear that it's all going to come to an end. And while yes, your life will end, your energy will not. It will continue onward, forever. But our consciousness has convinced us otherwise. We form this thought process, almost like we've been hypnotized, to think that we are all there is and all there ever will be, and that it's all going to come to an end. This leaves us unsatisfied and unhappy. But the universe is continuous, and you are technically the universe, so you will continue on as well. Your death is not the end of you. It's the death of your ego. Many people experience the same exact thing while living. Ego death. It tends to be induced through psychedelic drugs, LSD, shrooms, the list goes on. While working on this video, I actually experienced it myself, and although not intentional, it provided clarity in a way I've never before experienced. It's not the ego in the vernacular sense, as describing a person's self-worth. It's the philosophical ego. It's the complete loss of subjective self-identity. Everything that you believe you are will disappear. You're void of emotion, of connection to anything around you, of connection to what makes you, you. The idea of being a person doesn't make any sense. The words I, me, and myself have zero meaning whatsoever. The world can normally be put into two categories, myself and not myself. While experiencing ego death, this line is blurred. I am completely gone. There's only the awareness of existence. The lifetime accumulation of your thoughts and emotions are put on pause. It's as if you're on a cliff approaching an infinite void beneath you. Your life is continuous and exists all the way up the mountain until you reach the edge. Beneath you, though, is the unknown. Ego death is jumping into that void, leaving behind everything you've ever known. It's as if you've stepped out of your body into a separate entity. You start to see things for what they actually are, but things don't actually exist. Things is just a noun, it's a fragment of speech. And speech is just another instrument we've created to try and understand the world around us. Our senses allow us to go about our daily lives and traverse the world, but they don't really offer any explanations, so we have to make them up ourselves. While experiencing ego death, you disconnect from all of that. You have a heightened awareness. It's truly as if you're experiencing a higher level of consciousness that no person can understand. You reach this level that words can't explain. The instruments we made to try and understand our place in the universe shatter completely. Explaining it in terms of I saw or I felt don't seem reasonable. Our languages are instruments created to explain things that someone experiences. But while undergoing ego death, there is no someone. There is no me. So how do you describe it? It's as if your slate was wiped clean, your character's save file was corrupted, but you're still in the game. Because of this, ego death can be scary, but it can also be a very enlightening experience. It's both constricting and freeing. It's white and black. It's like you're defining what life is like through experiencing death. We cannot be more sensitive and welcoming to pleasure without being more sensitive and accepting to pain. You're flying and sinking at the same time, being pulled from below, and above, in every direction, at once. While going through it, I ended up reaching a moment of acceptance. Ego death, while often extremely anxiety-inducing, offers a glimpse into a reality free of that. A life free of your personal flaws, your daily thoughts, your responsibilities. It personally feels as if time is frozen, and wherever your mind wanders is free to judge things as they truly are. You are the observer and the observable. Surprisingly, the conclusion I came to is the same conclusion I came to while making a previous video of mine, and it's that nothing in life really matters. Fear in general tends to come from us not being able to make peace with the chaos that is the universe, not being able to cope with the idea of entropy, that everything is tending towards disorder. Forming an ego is disorderly in the same way. You go further and further down your own tunnel and stray further from everyone else. Experiencing ego death is breaking out of that tunnel, pulling back, and understanding that the network of these tunnels that encompass every human on Earth all eventually return back to the same place. When I die, when my ego is completely gone forever, when my physical body breaks down and no longer resembles the form it's in today, I'll still somehow be here. Right now, I'm an hourglass. The sand is slowly leaking its way to the bottom, and eventually it'll all be there. It's the end of the line for me. But when that day comes, the universe will stop by, take the hourglass, flip it over, and whatever made me me will then become something entirely different. We're all just a temporary collection of atoms, and whatever you and I subjectively believe we are won't last forever. But objectively, we will. For now, just enjoy the ride.
While your consciousness is still in this plane of existence, there's really only one thing you need to learn if you want to be successful and have a good life. Whether you're at school, work, or just interacting with friends and family, we're all subconsciously playing a game. The game of life. By understanding this game and how to win at it, you can become successful and really enjoy your time on this earth.
Are you the type of person to analyze every second of the interaction you just had with someone for hours on end, or are you normal? Either way, you probably don't think all that hard about every single detail of the decisions you make in social situations. But believe it or not, there's an entire scientific field that applies to social situations and decision making. We're talking about game theory. Game theory can be used to analyze both economic and social situations. It's essentially the science of strategy, and just like the reality it is trying to model, game theory can get really complicated. And yes, although game theory is relevant to games as we typically understand them, such as poker, most research in game theory focuses on how groups of people interact. Let's first define what a game is. So, what exactly is a game? It sounds like a stupid question, like who doesn't know what a game is? But games, in the field of game theory, are a slightly different concept to what you might expect. When it comes to game theoretic analysis, a game constitutes any interaction between multiple people where each person's payoff is affected by the decision made by others. Let's apply this definition of a game to a couple of games. Is Sudoku a game? Well, in the traditional sense, sure. But in game theory, no. Sudoku is not a game. Sudoku is not a game because how you decide to complete the puzzle doesn't affect any other player. There is, after all, only one player in the game. You. What about tic-tac-toe? Is that a game? Two players can play the game, and each box that is filled by one of the players affects the other player. Winning requires both players to respond optimally to what the other player is doing. So yes, it is a game. You could also have a situation where two shop owners choose from a finite number of positions where to strategically place their shops for maximum profit. They are each affected by what the other person does, since they may be opting for the same market. and there's certainly a win-lose situation here. So, even though placing your shot may not sound like much of a game, in the eyes of game theorists, it certainly is. Game theory is the study of games like these, and game theorists try to model games in a way that makes them easy to understand and analyze. I say easy, but a lot of games can end up having pretty similar properties or reoccurring patterns, and more often than not, things can get pretty complicated. Game theory has two main focuses: cooperative games and non-cooperative games. Most game theory models involve 5 conditions. It goes something like this. First, each player has 2 or more choices or sequence of choices. Think of these like typical moves in a game, like moving a chess piece. Second, all possible combinations of decisions or plays result in a clear outcome. Basically, you can win or lose. Third, it's clear how you can win or lose, and participants will gain or lose something depending on the outcome. Fourth, the players know the rules of the game as well as the payoffs of other players, meaning everyone is aware of what is desirable to the other players as well. And fifth, the players are rational and sensible people. Rational here means strictly that when they're faced with 2 alternatives, they'll choose the option that provides the greatest benefits. While players know the rules and their opponent's options, they don't know their opponent's actual decisions in advance. So players must choose options based on assumptions of what their opponents might choose. Some game theory scenarios are zero-sum games, meaning one player's win is another's loss, and vice versa. Others, however, allow mutual gains and losses. These games can involve multiple strategies. You can try to minimize the maximum losses another player can cause and make decisions based on probable outcomes. This all really just sounds a bit confusing, so here, just let me show you. If life is indeed a game, then the first rule is to be skeptical of other people's suggestions. As we said, if it's a game, someone else is going to be competing, so there's definitely going to be competition and sabotage. Perhaps a straightforward and well-known example is the prisoner's dilemma. The game goes like this. 2 criminals are caught red-handed and are arrested. Each has 2 choices. They can each either stay quiet or testify against their friend. Upon arrest, they are each separated and offered a deal. Testify against your friend and we'll let you off the hook easy with 1 year in prison and give the other person 10 years. If both stay quiet, the cops can't really prove the more serious charges and both criminals would spend only 2 years behind bars. If they both testify against each other, however, then both would get 5-year prison sentences. At first glance, keeping quiet seems like the best strategy. If they both did this, they would both be out after just 2 years. But right before they're about to testify, one of the two thinks to himself, what if I stay quiet and the other guy rats me out? Without knowing what the other person is actually going to decide, it's a reasonable worry to have. The smartest solution to this would be to react in a way that is beneficial regardless of what the other person does. A Nash equilibrium is actually a state in which no one person can improve, given what the others are doing. This means you're picking the best response to a particular strategy from your opponent. A quick analysis of the prisoner's dilemma reveals they would both most likely testify, which is the Nash equilibrium for this problem. This is because regardless of what the other person does, testifying will lead to a maximum sentence of 5 years, with the potential for a 1-year sentence. Meanwhile, if you don't testify, you could end up with a 10-year term. It's easily the safest thing to do considering neither party knows what the other is going to do, even though both criminals are better off if they just stayed quiet. Here, the individual incentive wins over group interest. Testifying is a better option, because you know that you'll be in trouble if you stay quiet but your friend testifies. But if you can think of that, your friend can too. So he knows you're likely going to testify given that it's the safer option for you, and you know he's likely going to testify too for the same reason, and you know that he knows that you're likely going to testify. You see the loop that's forming? These types of problems are examples of non-cooperative games, which means the 2 prisoners can't convey their intentions to each other. If they were able to talk to each other, however, we would be in a cooperative setting, and that would affect the likelihood of certain outcomes as you can imagine. For example, it'd become much easier for them to agree beforehand that they're both just going to stay quiet. On the contrary, a coordination game is one in which everyone benefits from working together. There's no incentive for either party to cheat, since it will result in a worse outcome than if they just cooperated. A good example is driving on the correct side of the road. You win nothing by driving on the wrong side of the road. But sometimes, you lose without even playing. The principal agent problem is when one person is allowed to make decisions on behalf of another person. In this situation, the first person is likely to prioritize their own interests and pursue their own goals. And well, yeah, that's the basis of modern politics. Game theory can also be applied to biology though. In fact, its application in the field of biology has allowed biologists to answer a lot of questions about evolution, which is remarkable since game theory was never designed for this. For example, it's helped scientists explain biological altruism, where an organism acts in a way that is most favorable for the overall species, even if that action is harmful to itself. A bird might warn the rest of the group about the arrival of a predator. Doing so risks its own life since it essentially announces itself to the predator. But this trait can later help that bird, assuming it survives of course, when other birds return the favor and warn it. These concepts might help you anticipate some of the strategies others might be using to get one over on you. But who really knows what they're thinking? The concept of guessing others' moves is what makes the game so tricky. While each player is likely to be certain about only their own move, they still have to speculate about other players' decisions, and more importantly, other players' conception of every other player's decisions. Essentially, you are no longer making a decision based on what you think is right. Rather, you're anticipating what your opponent thinks is right, and simply reacting to it. But then again, your opponent is doing the same exact thing. So who's really making the decision here? Whose mind is the actual decision being made in? Let's put it another way. Each player must know their own chance of coming out on top, guess everyone else's chance, and also guess what everyone else is guessing about their own chances of winning. Not only this, but you also really need to be able to guess what other players are guessing about your guesses about them. And now look, we're confused again. Another problem is that, although game theory has many benefits, it would be impossible to properly apply it in all situations. There will be times where rationality might not offer the right solutions, or where mutual benefit might not be the most ideal outcome. When you come up against these, you have to not only recognize them, but then also decide whether using game theory would be the most helpful way to deal with the situation. By then, the moment could already be gone. The assumption that everyone is going to be rational, a basic premise of game theory, is also a really risky one. Humans can be extremely unpredictable and emotional, and this makes the guessing work near impossible. There's a ton of real-life examples that illustrate the basic concepts of game theory. Apple and Samsung are involved in an endless game of advertising. It's not like either company needs to advertise. Besides, advertising can get extremely expensive. So why not just forego this task altogether and use the money for research and development? If both companies did this, then we'd probably have better phones by now. But sure enough, Apple banks on the possibility of Samsung advertising and gaining an edge over the market, and Samsung does the same. And that possibility soon turns into a certainty you and I have all come to accept. Now, this is an extremely simplistic example that bypasses many other variables, but you see the basic concept. Another good everyday example can be found in the treatment of public goods and property. If everyone decides to be good citizens and not litter, society benefits as a whole. But you're inevitably going to come up against one or more people who choose to essentially go rogue and behave selfishly by littering. This leads to society as a whole bearing the cost of cleaning up, all the while making not littering a less worthwhile decision. After all, if the road's already littered, the work to not litter is that much less meaningful. You can probably now see how applicable this is to other situations in life, like every big important decision we're supposed to be fixing, but more on that later. As interesting as it is, game theory can still only analyze simple situations with well-defined constraints, and you must remember that any model is a subset of reality, no matter how good it is. It's essentially intellectual guesswork. The bottom line? We're all constantly in the game. It's pretty impossible not to be. Our lives are endlessly and unavoidably impacted by the actions and decisions made by others. So you might as well play the game the best you can. And that interaction you spent hours analyzing after the other person has already long forgotten it? Maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. We're just trying to win the game of life. And the reason to win is so that you can be free of it.
We all want better for ourselves, whether it's a bigger house, nicer car, higher salary, thriving business, or more recognition. We all want things we don't have, and most of us spend the majority of our lives chasing these things. Success looks different to different people, but there's no arguing that we all have some definition of it, and that we often feel far from that definition. Thankfully, we aren't limited by our current circumstances, and with the right tools, we can get to where we want to be. Here is everything you need to start doing today to get ahead. Start by sleeping on a regular schedule. Sleeping on a regular schedule is a game changer for improving cognitive function and mood. In fact, having a consistent sleep schedule is often more important than sleeping for a specific number of hours. If you wake up at 6 a.m. for work but like to sleep in until 10 a.m. on the weekends, You might want to rethink your sleeping patterns so you sleep and wake up at the same time every day. Doing this helps your body develop a consistent rhythm and will allow you to build a schedule that works for you and the specific activities that you engage in. When you wake up, the first thing you should do is make your bed. Making your bed right after you get up might seem insignificant, but the reality is that accomplishing this small task at the start of your day sets the tone for the rest of it. You'll get a feeling of accomplishment that gives you the dopamine boost you need to tackle the more complex tasks you take on as your day progresses. It also gives you a sense of calm. Even if you can't control every aspect of your life, you're in control of where you lay your head to rest. And sorting out your sleeping area also means you'll be less likely to jump back into bed, which, as I'm sure you all know, can quickly lead to a very unproductive morning and entire day. I said sorting your sleeping area because even if you don't sleep on a bed or are currently unhoused, you can still get the benefits of making your bed by simply arranging your sleeping area. Whether it's rolling up mats or folding sheets, putting these things away gives you the same advantage as making your bed. You want to read books, magazines, newspapers? Just read. Several studies show that regular reading increases the communication between parts of your brain that control language and processing. It can also help improve concentration and prevent cognitive decline in old age. When trying to get ahead, most of us sacrifice our health at the altar of productivity. But the truth is that doing this is terrible in the long term, because if you're not in good health, you won't be able to produce your best. But just like exercising, meditating, and eating healthy, these are all tips you've heard before. So let's get a little more specific. How do you get ahead at work? Well, first it's essential to identify your goals. If you approach every workday with a big question mark, you'll likely lose focus and sense of direction quickly. But once you identify a goal like a raise, a promotion, or a particular benchmark, you can start each day with ideas on how to get closer to your goal, even if it takes you a while to get there. That's why it's good to be specific. Think of yourself like a specialist rather than a generalist. With unlimited YouTube videos and college courses, many of us take advantage of dabbling in different skills and hobbies. The problem is that doing too many things can spread our attention so thin that it's difficult to hone in on that one skill that will move us forward. By becoming a specialist instead, especially in your work, you're more likely to build an impressive skill set that makes you stand out in the current difficult labor market. Of course, having hobbies and interests is essential for an excellent work-life balance, but in your career, just being okay at a lot of things doesn't get you nearly as far as being great at one or two things. Getting ahead is easier if you love what you do, or at least like it. Loving your work can sometimes be misunderstood as loving every aspect of your job, which is quite frankly impossible. Work is called work for a reason. It's not helpful to set the unrealistic expectation that you'll love every second of it. But suppose you are interested enough and perhaps even fulfilled at times by the work you do. In that case, you're more likely to push yourself further, enjoy building your skill sets, and face challenges with optimism rather than negativity. Once you get extremely proficient at your job, you'll soon discover that your skills can only get you so far. To get further ahead, you need to start promoting yourself. Now, self-promotion can sometimes get a bad rep, but if you've put in the time and effort to become a better employee, boss, or creative thinker, you deserve to brag about it. Also, making others aware of your accomplishments can do wonders to lift you off your plateau and keep moving forward. And when you do, having the right people around you is crucial. Stanford Graduate School of Business professor Bob Sutton says that your manager can have a more significant effect on your happiness and success than the company you work at. So whenever you have the opportunity, always choose to work with people who are quick to offer help when necessary. One thing to remember though is that if your managers or coworkers are there to help you, you have to be there to help them too. Being liked by people you work with and liking them back isn't so bad. You don't need the tough exterior that reigns superior in the workplace for so long. Putting up walls will cut you off from opportunities and, more importantly, relationships. Ask anyone anywhere in any field, and they'll all tell you that relationships are the key ingredient to a successful career. And how do you build relationships? Network. It's an annoying word, I know. Like me, you probably cringe at the idea of artificially making acquaintances for the sole purpose of advancing your career, but networking doesn't have to be like that. Think about all the people you've collaborated with. You might not have become friends with them, but you did get to know their innovative, motivated, and creative sides. If they needed a recommendation, wouldn't you happily give them one? Exactly. Networking in a meaningful way doesn't have to feel forced. It's building genuine connections with people who understand your work and are likely to help you in the future. As your network expands, you might start to compare yourself to others, but you shouldn't do that, because comparison is the thief of joy. Sometimes the best thing you can do to get ahead is to take what you want out of the equation. It may seem counterintuitive, but recognizing how your work contributes to other people's lives can make you more productive than just thinking about how it benefits you. Adam Grant is a renowned organizational psychologist who studies human behavior and helps people find motivation and meaning in their lives, especially in the workplace. In one of his earliest jobs selling ads for a travel guide series, he brought in a student who had been awarded a scholarship from his travel guide company to meet his colleagues, and after meeting the student, the entire company's staff spent 142% more time on the phone and brought in 171% more revenue using the same sales scripts as before. Even though the content of their sales pitch didn't change, they were motivated, consciously and subconsciously, to do better by simply seeing someone who had been positively impacted by their work. So instead of worrying about what other people can do for you to help you get ahead, flip the switch and start thinking about what you can do for others. You'll be pleasantly surprised at how much more productive you are when you know your work is improving other people's lives. Now, the truth is, these things we've discussed aren't gas pedals you can step on to automatically speed you to the front of the rat race, because in reality, getting ahead is about more than a set of quick fixes. In fact, ahead isn't even a destination, it's a mindset. And it's essential to recognize that what might feel good in the short term might limit you in the long term. Eating an entire bowl of ice cream might seem like a fantastic idea today, and it might be, but keep doing that every day for the next few years and your health will suffer as a result. The same goes for how you can work to get ahead in life. Finding shortcuts or avoiding conflict can feel good, but when you decide to take the easy route, you're cheating yourself out of potential learning opportunities. Of course, it's equally important to be smart. Dragging things out just to feel like you're doing something can be a nasty trap. Mainly because maintaining your stamina is another critical component to getting ahead. It's easy to quit, most people do it. To become one of the people who don't, you'll need to push yourself, but not so hard that you burn out. You have to seek out challenges, nothing impossible, just practical ones that give you a healthy dose of dopamine once you accomplish them. You'll find small bits of motivation to hang on to when things get tough. You'll dig in and hang on even when things get rough. Failure is inevitable in all areas of life. No relationship is perfect, no job is perfect, no family is perfect. But instead of thinking of failure as a setback, think of it as an opportunity. It's information about your current mental and physical limitations and data about how you can improve. It's a reminder of how good it feels to try even when things don't work out. Failure teaches you that you aren't in this alone, and that asking for help isn't something to be ashamed of. Asking for help is actually one of life's remarkable skills, and so is saying, "I'm sorry." Accepting responsibility when you've done something wrong and not dishing out a meaningless apology allows others to see your humility. Once you accept that you make mistakes, sometimes even ones that hurt others, you're freed from the assumption that you always know what to do. Confusion is a part of life, and if you want to get ahead, you better learn how to navigate it. The only way to do that is by being able to adjust. We're all born into certain circumstances, hold particular beliefs, and expect different things out of life. But change is necessary even when it doesn't feel all that great. But here science has our back. You've probably heard the distinction between right and left-brained people. The theory is that if you're right-brain dominant, you're more intuitive, a creative thinker, qualitative about the way you perceive things, and you tend to look at the world with a big picture lens. On the other hand, if you're left-brain dominant, you're said to be more analytical, you pay attention to details, are ruled by logic, and you view the world more specifically and objectively. But a 2013 study by the University of Utah looked at the brains of over 1,000 young people between the ages of 7 and 29, and found no evidence of what we've been told about left and right-brained people. The study found that the activity in the left and right halves of a subject's brain was similar regardless of their personality. This is freeing because it means that there isn't some inherent brain chemistry that determines how you think and act. Depending on the situation, you can choose to be more analytical or more intuitive. You can adapt. So what is getting ahead? Is it earning more money, or is it about being able to look back and be proud of not just what you've done, but who you are? I'd argue for the latter, because just as much as you want to get ahead, it's easy to get ahead of yourself. To a place where you become so obsessed with your future, a place where your specific goals and feelings become so crucial to you that you lose sight of your journey. When people say it's lonely at the top, I often reply that they neglected everyone on their climb who loved them because they were so focused on the summit. Think about getting ahead more as a process rather than a race that you need to finish. Even as you're striving for excellence, always remember to stay in the present, looking around to take in the beauty of the experiences you're given on this journey of life. Getting ahead shouldn't have us running so fast that we pass on in an attempt to pass others. After all, life isn't a race to the finish, but an experience to be relished.
For the past month or so, I've been thinking a lot about life, and when people say that, they usually mean what they want to do in life, whether that be their career, or relationships, or entertainment, or leisure. But I've been thinking differently. Of course, I've been thinking about those things, but I've also been thinking about how much of your life is really yours. How much of your life is really being lived to its full potential? Are you living, or are you just existing? On average, you're gonna get about 79 years on this big rock called Earth. If you live in Monaco, it's closer to 90. If you live in Chad, you'll be lucky to get 50. Regardless, we don't get 79 years of freedom. We have responsibilities and things that we can't ignore. Most importantly, our bodies. Assuming you sleep 8 hours a night on average, about a third of your life, or 26 years, is going to be spent sleeping. So right away, we're down from 79 to 53. But it doesn't stop there. Chances are if you're watching this video, you're going to or have gone to school. In the United States, you'll go for at least 12 years. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for 36 weeks a year. This amounts to 17,280 hours spent just inside the school building. But wait, we also have to factor in homework and out-of-school activities, among other things. So, this is more like 22,000 to 25,000 hours, or about 3 years of your life. If you go to college or university afterwards, make it 5 years instead. We're down to 48 years. Well, all this schooling and money you spent getting a degree has to be put to some use, right? Chances are you'll try and get a job in the field of whatever it is your degree is in. It'll probably be a full-time job, so you'll be working 40-hour weeks pretty regularly, if not more than that. Let's say you get 2 weeks of vacation per year. The average person works for about 40 to 50 years of their life, so we'll just go with the average and say 45. Over your entire life, you'll work on average about 90,000 hours, or about 10 years of your life. We have 38 years left. Wait, depending on where you live, your commute to work will vary. You might drive yourself, you might walk, you might use an Uber or a taxi. Regardless, your commute to and from work, on average, takes about 1.5 hours a day. Adding this up over your entire working career, it amounts to 17,520 hours, or about 2 years of your life. 36 years left. All of this work and studying really builds up an appetite, so you should probably spend some time eating. On an average day, we spend about 70 minutes just eating food to survive. In your 79 years of life, you'll spend about 32,000 hours just eating, or about 4 years of your life. Down to 32. Well, after you're done eating, you have to clean up, and maybe do some chores around the house. On average, you spend about 1 hour a day doing tasks just around your house, cleaning up after you eat, washing dishes, doing laundry, showering, and plenty of other stuff. This amounts to nearly 29,000 hours over the course of your life, or about 3 years. 29 years left. Eventually, all of that food and water has to leave your body somehow. You'll spend about 3 months of your life just sitting on the toilet. Yeah. Of course, we also waste time, and we do it pretty well. Over the course of our lifetimes, we'll spend about 115,000 hours on our phones, or about 13 years. This, of course, is just your phone. This doesn't include you watching TV, you playing games, among other things. 16 years left. Assuming you can afford to retire at the average age of 62, you'll spend the rest of your life living the luxuries of retirement, if you can still function properly. Over 50% of retired people over the age of 65 have some sort of disability, with 15% of those people having 3 or more. Chances are, if you are one of these people, you'll be in and out of medical care pretty often. So, those final 16 years of freedom you have, it's a coin flip. That doesn't exactly entail freedom. So overall, you have 1 year in your 79-year life to really and truly do what you want to do. But despite the age you might be, young or old, you may be nearing the end of your time with some of the most important people in your life. For example, while you're young and in school from the ages of 1 to 18, you'll most likely be spending nearly every day in the presence of your parents. After you finish your schooling, assuming your parents are in their mid-40s, we'll say they have about 30 years left in their life. The real world starts to set in. Your job, your possible relationships, your important things to do in life take priority. Eventually, if you leave your hometown, you'll only be seeing your parents around holidays and special occasions, maybe 10 days a year. So, 300 days left with the people who brought you into the world, whereas before you would see them almost every single day. You have already spent 95% of the time that you will ever spend with your parents in the first 18 years of your life. And now, you only have the remaining 5% for the rest of your life. At the end of the day, there's only one thing that matters, and that's your own happiness. What many people don't realize is that they do so many things in life just to try and succeed as opposed to fulfilling a purpose. They work a job they hate for 40 years just to make that extra $30,000 a year so they can afford a car that they only drive to work. It's temporary happiness, not genuine happiness. People go to school to become a doctor because their mom or their dad or somebody else told them to, not because they actually want to. I really hope that every single person watching this video gets insanely rich and famous so that they can finally realize that this isn't the point of life. The point is to be happy with what you're doing while you're doing it. Alright, sure, the 45 working years or however long you're working is going to be hard to get past. But what if you don't hate waking up every day to go to work? What if your work is your happiness? You see, life isn't a straight path. You can't map it out perfectly one-to-one. It just doesn't work like that. We spend every day planning on what we're going to do the next, instead of just taking in the day for what it actually is. Sure, we have to eat, duh. But what if we spend that time eating with friends or family, or just people who make your life better? Your commute to work might be long and tedious sometimes, but what if you spend that time listening to podcasts, or carpooling with coworkers and friends? The 13 years we waste on our phones might seem useless, but what if we use that time to build the business you've always wanted to, or build the brand you've always wanted, or make a YouTube channel to talk to people about the random ideas you get? You'll bring so much value to people that you never even thought was possible. Let's say you take care of yourself and regularly work out and eat decently well. Your chances of being healthy later in life is much more likely, and you'll have much more free time to master the things that you really want, whether that be a skill or just relationships with others. No matter what you or I or any person on this planet does, time doesn't stop for anyone. Time is the one thing you cannot get back. If you lose a lot of money, it's fine. You can get more. If your friend decides to turn their back on you, it's fine. There's millions of people out there in the same situation. But time, you can't get it back. Once it's gone, it's gone. How many days have you spent doing the same mundane tasks that you hate? And more importantly, when is it going to end? Life is about choices. Every choice you've ever made has led you to this exact moment watching this video. And given that you only have one life, at least in this universe, why not make your own decisions? So many people live life predicated on somebody else's opinion, which is dumb. People have so many barriers in life, but they aren't really about money, they aren't about time. They aren't about how you look, it's about opinions. Other people's opinions. Probably about 90% of people are unhappy because they value someone else's opinion more than their own. When you're old and unable to do the things that you could have when you're younger, you'll regret. And regret hurts more than any breakup, failure, or anything else ever could. Life doesn't have to suck, you don't have to regret everything. That FOMO, or fear of missing out, is a poison. Instead of living trying to mimic people you see on Instagram or YouTube or social media, just live based on your own terms. Instead of just observing and living passively, really start to think about what you do with your time. Does that mean call your boss and tell him you quit? No. Does that mean drop out of school tomorrow? No. All it means is to truly decide what you want in life and put yourself in the right direction. It's not gonna happen overnight, that's not the point. There would be no journey then. As cliche as it sounds, your 79-year journey here is very short. Sure, it's technically the longest thing you'll ever do, but the universe is 13.8 billion years old. If the universe's history was condensed down into 24 hours, the world as we know it, with cars and airplanes and civilization as we know it, would only come into existence in the very last second. Block out any and all negativity in your life, and once you can truly realize that the only opinion that matters is your own, life can get pretty clear, and the noises inside your head get pretty quiet.
If you truly want to make the most out of your short time here on Earth, you need to live like you're dying, replied one of my friends a few weeks ago after I jokingly brought up the idea of dropping everything and moving to Portugal amidst our conversation about work stress. We both laughed the moment off, but I went home and that one line just kept ringing inside my head. What does it really mean to live like you're dying? For most people, including myself, when we hear statements like these, cool experiences flood our minds. Things like running a marathon or learning a new language or flying in a hot air balloon and being part of a flash mob. And while all of these things seem exciting, I just couldn't help but wonder. If I were on my deathbed, would the fact that I had gone skydiving or could speak French really bring me any peace? It seems like underneath our modern and somewhat glamorized understanding of what it means to live like we're dying lies much more sober and pragmatic questions that we rarely ever take the time to ask ourselves until circumstances leave us no choice. Imagine you wake up tomorrow with a minor headache, one of many you've been having recently. They've been manageable, so nothing alarming. It's probably nothing, you say to yourself as you pop an Advil and get ready for the day. But by bedtime, the pain is just so unbearable that you have to go see a doctor. As you lie on the hospital bed facing the bright white lights flooding the entire room, your doctor walks in with a file in his hand and a very grim look on his face. He says to you that they found a brain tumor. That can't be, you say so to yourself. Just yesterday you were planning on taking a trip with your friends for the summer. To make matters worse, the doctor tells you there's nothing they can do about the tumor but manage it. It's terminal and you have less than 18 months. Walking out of the hospital with the realization of your own mortality staring you right in the face. In what ways would your perception about life and what matters change? This might not be the case for many of us, but the lessons in it are universal. How would you change the way you live your life day to day if you found out you only had 10 more years to live? How about 5 or 1 year or even 6 months? If you only had just 1 week left here on Earth, what would you cherish the most? These questions are intense, and it makes sense why people who are fortunate enough to be able to avoid them, for the most part, choose to do so. But what if the answer to our questions about what makes life meaningful lies not in the quality of our experiences, as we're so commonly told, but rather in the process of letting all of those experiences go? There may be no profession that grants a person a closer look into the experience of death than palliative care nursing. This caregiving approach aims to ease the suffering of patients with terminal illnesses. One palliative care nurse, Bronnie Ware, who assisted patients through the last 12 weeks of life, wrote in her book, The Top 5 Regrets of Dying, of the experiences she gathered from her patients in the face of mortality. The top 5 regrets were: I wish I let myself be happier. I wish I stayed in touch with my friends. I wish I had had the courage to express my feelings. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And most commonly, I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. As I read through the list, what struck me the most was the second most common regret. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. I found this regret so ironic because of how incompatible it is with the way that we, as not yet dying people, so commonly seek to derive meaning from our lives. The truth is that most of us don't have the privilege of working fulfilling jobs. Many of us are stuck in the rat race doing boring jobs with no altruistic value, just to fend for ourselves. There's only a handful of people who get to find fulfillment and meaning in their work. People like Paul Kalanithi, a neurosurgeon who was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer at the age of 36, during his last year of residency. Paul spent the final year of his life continuing to work as a surgeon, even when he was forced to stare at his own mortality in the face. In his novel, When Breath Becomes Air, Paul wrote, "I don't think I ever spent a minute of any day wondering why I did this work or whether it was even worth it." The call to protect life, and not merely life, but another's identity, was obvious in its sacredness. He spent the last few months on Earth powering through excruciating pain to complete shifts that, at times, spanned multiple days and nights and required his non-stop focus. It's amazing that Paul was able to find meaning and fulfillment in his work as a neurosurgeon, but for many of us, we spend 40 hours every week working a job we wouldn't consider worth it in the final moments of life. The types of jobs that, on our deathbeds, we'll end up wishing we hadn't worked so hard at. The reality is that finding a career that provides both economic security and a personal sense of meaning is quite a difficult balance to strike, and maybe one that not everyone will be able to achieve. So then is all hope lost for us who cannot have meanings tied to our jobs and are forced to continue in our unfulfilling endeavors? Matthew Ricard, a renowned writer, philosopher, and Buddhist monk, once wrote, "We try to create outer conditions that we believe will make us happy, but it's the mind itself that translates outer conditions into happiness or suffering. This is why we can be deeply unhappy, even though we have it all, and conversely, we can remain strong and serene in the face of hardship." What if it wasn't the profession itself that gave Paul meaning in life? What if it was the way his mind translated his profession that gave him strength and serenity even in the final days of life? A recent survey in the United States found that around 1 in 5 physicians plan on leaving the practice within 2 years, while about 1 in 3 health professionals plan on at least reducing the workload within the next 12 months. So even in a profession that's altruistic in nature, there's still loads of people with a desire to quit, whether it's for stress-related reasons or simply because it doesn't fulfill them in the way they perhaps thought it would. Imagine again yourself with a terminal illness, except this time you're lying in a hospital bed experiencing the last few days of your life. It's been 18 months after the tumor was first discovered. In the past 6 months, the illness had progressed rapidly, causing more deterioration to your mobility, cognition, and overall identity than you ever would have imagined on the day of your initial diagnosis. The illness has left you with no choice but to gradually say goodbye to all of the activities that once brought you joy. Even simple everyday things like brewing yourself a pot of coffee in the morning or going on a spontaneous walk around the lake with a friend are long gone now. As you lay there in that bed listening to the beeping of the machines that are struggling to keep you alive, will you be able to still feel any happiness? Will you be able to feel as though your life still has a meaning, or will all semblance of meaning and happiness be lost? Thinking about these questions is unpleasant, and it makes a lot of sense why so many of us avoid them. In fact, some people are so terrified of death that it becomes a taboo subject, something they avoid talking about at all costs. But emerging evidence suggests that the fear of death might just be the root cause of some of the real dangers in our world today. Terror management theory proposes that there's a connection between the awareness of our own mortality and the ways in which we will go on to impose and force our worldviews onto others. If this theory were to be proven true, it could go on to expose that things like nationalism, terrorism, international conflicts, and racism are caused by our individual and collective awareness of mortality. There have been several hundred studies done on TMT yet thus far. The results are still a bit scattered, but one conclusion that can pretty much be safely made is that when someone is reminded of their mortality, a common coping mechanism for the terror they feel is to enter an unconscious, fear-driven state of mind. Within this fear space, people are more likely to double down on whatever attachments they have to the social, political, racial, or other cultural groups they identify with as a means of seeking comfort in community. Although these findings are extraordinarily telling about the ways in which our fears of death influence the ways we act in our lives, what they don't account for are the people who aren't afraid of death. The people who have found ways to soothe their unconscious terror from surrounding the topic of mortality and have found a way to accept it, allowing it to be instead a motivating factor for the ways they choose to live. Take Claire Wineland, for example, a girl who was born with cystic fibrosis and given about 10 years to live. Despite the tremendous pain her disease caused and having to grow up with the ever-present awareness of death looming over her shoulder, Claire spent most of her younger years playing games with nurses and elaborately decorating her hospital rooms, exploring every opportunity to feel happiness and a sense of meaning. Sadly, things became much more sinister when Claire's lungs collapsed at the age of 13, and she fell into a medically induced coma with just a 1% chance of survival. Claire miraculously emerged from the coma after 16 days, but as she came back to reality, she soon realized that the near-death experience had radically transformed her understanding of what mattered most in life. A year later, at the age of 14, Claire started a foundation called the Clarity Project to raise money for other terminally ill children with cystic fibrosis. She then spent the rest of her teenage years giving inspirational speeches filled with insights such as, "The quality of your life isn't determined by whether you're healthy or sick or rich or poor. It's determined by what you make out of your experience as a human being. And the moment you realize it's not about avoiding suffering, it's about making something from your suffering, you're incredibly free." When you listen to Claire deliver these insights, it's hard to believe that she was just a teenager at the time she said them. Her wisdom allotted her the nickname Little Buddha amongst her followers. Although Claire only lived to the age of 21, so many would say that her awareness of her mortality, combined with the near-death experience, accelerated her understanding of who she was and what she wanted to do in the world. While many of us spend our entire lives from 0 to 80 without any sense of meaning, faced with her own mortality, Claire was able to live meaningfully with the knowledge that she might not have as much time as everyone else. And Claire's story doesn't exist in a vacuum. Reports of people discovering newfound clarity about what makes their lives meaningful within terminal illness diagnosis and near-death experiences are rather common. On her experience of being diagnosed with breast cancer, Audre Lorde, an infamous American poet, writer, and activist, wrote, "In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality and of what I wished and wanted for in my life, however short it might be, priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted were my silences. I was gonna die, if not sooner rather than later, whether or not I had ever spoken to myself. My silences hadn't protected me. Your silence won't protect you." That message about the importance of speaking your truth rings loud and clear throughout the entirety of Lorde's book, The Cancer Journals. It also ties in perfectly with the most common regret reported by Bronnie Ware's patients. "I wish I had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me." We live in an exciting, rapidly growing, and ever-evolving world, during a time where the invention of things like the internet, virtual reality, and electric cars have created more possibilities than ever before. Every day we face an immense amount of pressure to be more successful, make more money, connect with more people, achieve larger-than-life accolades, break world records, and traverse the unknown. And yet, despite all of this, our core values and what matters most in the end have remained the same for millennia. We all want to have lived a life with a sense of purpose, meaning, and fulfillment. But despite how seemingly obvious these core values seem, the day-to-day chaos of being alive can make them quite difficult to live by. The trick to do so lies in learning how to hold these deep truths close, despite their commonality, and to continuously remember to prioritize what matters most, even in situations where doing so isn't the easiest or even the most beneficial choice. Imagine yourself lying in that hospital bed again, one last time, except now you are in your final minutes on this plane of existence. You reflect back on the pivotal moments of your life with newfound clarity, watching little snippets of memory swirl around your head like a 3D movie. While not everyone will suffer a terminal illness, all of us, in one way or another, will have to come face to face with death. Would you be happy if that moment came today? Tomorrow? 7 days from now, or even 6 months from now? If you won't, then you need to start living like you're dying. Death can only be interpreted by people who are alive. Yet, since no one who is alive can simultaneously experience what it's like to be dead, who then does death actually concern? This logic is oddly reassuring. Even so, if my doctor were to call me up right now and tell me that I would die in 12 hours, I would still likely spend all that time in a state of debilitating fear and anxiety. Just thinking about this possibility makes me realize that whether I like it or not, death terrifies me right now, even as a person who is fortunate enough to be in good health. It seems irrational and perhaps illogical to fear something that I have so little knowledge about or control over. But no matter what I do, I just can't seem to shake this nagging fear of the unknown. And I'm not alone. According to the 2017 survey of American fears conducted by Chapman University, 20.3% of Americans are either afraid of or very afraid of dying. But why do we have such a strong fear of death? The fear of death largely comes from the uncertainty and lack of control of the situation. But perhaps there's a better way to think about our lives and our eventual passing that might end this fear, or at least chip away at its root cause. To start off, let's talk about the only other life event, aside from death, which has happened and will continue to happen to every single person who will ever exist on this planet. Birth. Try to imagine the moment you were born. Of course, you can't actually remember this, I know, but just try for a second to bring yourself back to that time. The moment when you were pulled out of the darkness by a mysterious set of hands, only to be flooded by fluorescent lights and the chaotic bustle of a delivery room. As your eyes adjusted to the light for the very first time, you also had to take in a room full of total strangers who were all likely staring at you. Some of whom you'd never see again, and others you could go on to spend the next 80 plus years with on this journey we call life. This journey that you, in that hospital room however many years ago, had absolutely no tangible knowledge about. We talk about how scary death is, but the truth is birth was probably equally as scary, if not more so. It's no wonder that we judge the health of the newborn by how hysterically they cry in the delivery room. My point in bringing all of this up is to say that death isn't the first life-changing existential experience you've gone through. Was birth scary? Most likely. But every single day since then you learned more and more about the experience that is being alive. To the point where you thought of going back to the state you were in before birth has now become the idea you fear. Mark Twain once wrote, "I do not fear death. I had been dead for billions and billions of years before I was born, and had not suffered the slightest inconvenience from it." This perfectly expresses another truth that most people fail to consider when it comes to death. We all know and seem to accept easily that there was an infinite amount of time before we were alive on Earth. So why is it so hard for some of us to grapple with the fact that there will also be an infinite amount of time that comes after our existence on Earth? When someone dies at an early age, we feel great sadness for all the earthly events they won't be able to be a part of. But when a baby is born, we don't mourn everything they missed out on before their delivery. We all seem to know how nonsensical it would be to feel sad about that. A baby's time of birth is what it is, a fixed situation which nobody has had really any control over. But when it comes to death, there seems to be so many what-ifs or if-onlys involved. Maybe it's because of the how and when of our passing seems to say something about the way that we live. Consider the death of Robert Atkins, the man who dedicated a large majority of his life to refining the Atkins diet and preaching it as the most health-conscious way to live, only to die by slipping on an icy sidewalk. People often reference this as a way to say that death is inevitable, no matter how healthily one chooses to live. A message which, ironically enough, is the exact opposite of the one Atkins spent his life trying to convey. Stories like Robert's are another major reason why some of us find death so frightening. The idea that the where, how, and when of our passing puts a climactic punctuation mark at the end of our existence and somehow adds to the definition of what our life meant. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. We seem to accept and even participate in creating these punctuations or labels, even when it comes to external things and people that we have no interpersonal connections to. When a breaking news story emerges where an innocent person is murdered, the majority of us collectively label their life as beautiful and their death as tragic, and when that person's killer is found guilty and sentenced to death, we label their life as despicable and their death as deserved. Labeling others is a comforting habit that is strongly hardwired into our psychology. It's part of how we organize, simplify, and make sense of our world. Yet we all know that even the best one-word label couldn't possibly be used to sum up the entirety of who and what a person is, and what the life they lived was. So the idea that our death could assign us with one of these simplistic labels, which don't allow any room for the complexity of who we really were, is terrifying. If there's anything certain and non-debatable, it's that death is a termination of our physical bodies. Our hearts stop beating, our neurons cease firing, and we take one last breath. Our physical presence here on Earth is terminated at the time of our deaths. While this is undeniably true, it still leaves us with multiple unanswerable questions. A large one being, are we just a body, a spectacularly designed or random collection of cells, atoms, and molecules that is purely physical? Or is it possible that we're composed of a physical body, a physical mind, and something else? Something intangible and non-physical like, for the lack of a better term, a soul. This debate has been going on between philosophers for a millennium. Epicurus believed quite adamantly that we are merely physical beings whose deaths were a total annihilation of our existence, while some of Plato's most famous dialogues argue for the immortality of the soul. If you believe that there's nothing more to us than the atoms and DNA that compose our physical bodies and minds, then you might be what modern philosophers call a physicalist. If, on the other hand, your inclination is to believe that we are composed of a physical body, a physical mind, and something intangible that resembles the soul, then you might be what they call a dualist. There are other variations and subsects of these definitions, but for simplicity's sake, we'll leave it there. Thinking back now to the problem of death with all this in mind, we can clearly see that whether or not someone is a dualist or physicalist makes an enormous difference in the ways they would interpret their beliefs about death, and ultimately whether they would fear death or not. If death is a definitive end to the physical body, then, as far as physicalists are concerned, death is a pretty straightforward pill to swallow. Death is just the end. But for dualists, the possibilities are quite endless. For if we possess something like a soul, then the range of options of what could happen to that soul after our physical bodies die is wide open. While some people cling to religious texts and beliefs for some answers and comfort, non-religious people are left with a huge uncertainty over what life after death holds. And as humans, we have evolved to be naturally scared of the unknown. Maybe the best place to turn to for further investigation of death is to consider the stories of people who have died. The Near-Death Experience Research Foundation presents what many would consider to be the most compelling scientific evidence for life after death. Jeffrey Long, the foundation's creator, has studied and examined the accounts of thousands of people who have reportedly had near-death experiences. While no two people's near-death experiences are exactly the same, there are some characteristic features that have been commonly observed. Long has conducted and posted 5,100 interviews to date with people who have claimed to have had an NDE, and compiled the data he's gotten from them over the years. In this, he identified 12 essential elements that are consistently present in his subjects, some of which are an out-of-body experience, encountering deceased relatives, friends or mystical beings, and experiencing a sense of alteration in time or space. Technically speaking, having any kind of lucid experience while one is clinically dead, without a heartbeat, should be impossible. Still, 74% of the people interviewed reportedly felt conscious and alert during their time spent dead than they did in their waking lives. The remaining 20.4% reportedly felt the same amount of consciousness awareness in death as they do alive, while only 5.2% said they experienced less. Even though the belief that death is the end of our consciousness is relatively common, out of the thousands of people who participated in this survey, only 5% reported that to be true for their near-death experience. These statistics are startling for sure, and there are plenty more like this that are equally compelling. But I think that sometimes it can be too easy to tune out the significance of figures like these because, well, you can find statistical data to support just about any claim you're trying to make these days. Perhaps a more powerful and effective way to discuss NDEs is to delve into specific stories. Take this one, for example, reported by a woman who died by accidental electrocution at the age of 7. I was transported out of my body and surrounded by the brightest, warmest light ever. The only way to explain it is our true home. It felt very familiar. It felt like home. I had never felt at home here on Earth before or after this experience. I didn't feel or see my body. I believe I was more like a pure light source that flows just like a river of pure love and joy. I was just so happy to be home. Another person claimed that the Earth is like a film that hasn't been developed. Not until we reach the other side is the film developed. Everything will be seen in beautiful colors that don't exist here on Earth. And another said, in an instant, I knew that the life we live is an illusion. It's not real because it's a creation of our minds. We continually create thoughts and then project these thoughts outside of the mind, just as cinematic frames are projected onto a screen. Reports like these are incredibly interesting, but you might be wondering where the proof is. For all we know, these are just subjective accounts that people could be just making up. And you would be right. Sadly, as of right now, there is no definitive proof of the validity of NDEs. Like you, I also started off my research into this a little bit skeptical, but the more of these stories I heard and read over time, the harder it became for me to believe that there wasn't at least some validity to them. No matter what belief you choose to carry with you about what happens to us after we die, I think it's important to research the literature out there. Learn what the people who have first-hand knowledge have to say, and use all the information to form a real, thought-out opinion for yourself. Because sadly, there is no way to tie a bow on this topic and wrap it up nicely. No matter what any of us say, death will always remain an existential mystery. But if you struggle with the fear of death, here is something that helped me tremendously, in hopes that it helps you too. The most comforting thing about death is that it will happen to us all. To everything, there is a season. A time to be born, and a time to die. For some, it's grandma or grandpa. For others, it's mom or dad. For some, it's a brother, a sister, a friend, or a lover. Whoever it is, whenever it is, one thing is for sure. At some point, we have all experienced the sting of death. We often talk so much about the beginning of life. We throw parties to find out what the birth gender of the baby is, and then we throw another party to shower them with gifts. And then we throw another party once they spend their first 12 months on this earth, and every 12 months after that. We share stories about the day we were born, albeit stories we cannot remember ourselves and have only formed from the pieces we've been told by different sources. We talk a lot about birth, but usually never about death. Most times, the first we're forced to speak of it, it has already taken someone we love. But it doesn't have to be this way. We are all going to die someday, so we might at least talk about it while we can. Here is to death. As everyone knows, death is the end of, well, everything for you. It's when all the body's vital functions stop permanently. Your heart stops beating, your breath ceases. You lose all brain activity. Their heart is failing, and the body is now experiencing circulation changes. Their heartbeat is becoming fainter, and their skin no longer radiates like the summer sun. The pale gray blue of winter starts to take over, most visibly on the knees, hands, and legs. Their breathing becomes erratic. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast. Sometimes it's faint, sometimes it's loud. Cheyne-Stokes is happening now. They take several breaths, then a long pause with no breathing at all. And just when we think they're gone, they gasp and take yet another breath. They're not there yet, but they're close. In a few hours, they'll take another long pause. But then, there will be no gasp to break the silence. When most people are about to leave us to the other side of life, they claim to feel a sense of readiness, like they're wrapped around Mother Nature's arms, similar to the feeling of a baby in their mother's womb. There's a sense of comfort, a sense of completion, a sense of peace. People are often well aware of what is coming next, and can even hold on for something significant to happen before giving up the ghost. You might wait for your mother to come so you can tell her you appreciate everything she did for you as a child. Or perhaps place a call to a friend to tell them you forgive them for everything they did wrong to you. Or maybe you're waiting to hold your kids in your arms again, or kiss your partner on the cheek one last time. When death comes knocking, we often already know who's at the door. We prepare ourselves and ready our houses before walking out the door, locking it, and throwing out the key. As we walk out the door, we gradually become confused. We slip into an unconscious state one last time as we draw the curtains to what our life was. As we walk out the door, we gradually become confused. We slip into an unconscious state one last time as we draw the curtains to what was our life. We die. Everything that happens up until this point, we know and understand, but everything that happens afterward is still a complete mystery to us. The craziest thing about death is that we often describe it as irreversible. What is dead will stay dead, but there are thousands of people out there who have been medically described as dead, but have come back, carrying with them tons of incredible stories. We call these near-death experiences, because again, we believe if it was actual death, they wouldn't be alive to tell the story. But is that true? We might just never know. There's a wealth of information out there with regards to near-death experiences. People who have been medically described as dead for hours, and some days, come back to life with stories of out-of-body experiences, memories of their time in the afterlife, down to some incredible specifics about this side of life that they just couldn't have made up. One thing many people who have near-death experiences agree upon is the fact that the phrase, "life flashes before your eyes," is very true. Just before the heart flatlines, we're often presented with a view of our entire life. However, it's not like we think it is. It's not the big moments in life that flash before our eyes. It's not the wedding, the graduation, the first time you heard the cry of your child. It's just random stuff. It's riding your bike as a kid, sitting at your desk and randomly checking your email, staring at a white cat while climbing a flight of stairs. It's the things that we don't give any thought to, the moments we don't usually remember in life, that are brought before us in the face of death. If you thought staring at a white cat while climbing a flight of stairs was oddly specific, well, it's because it is. A young man who went through a near-death experience saw this moment as one of life's flashes. However, he could not remember ever being on that staircase or seeing a white cat. So after he was resuscitated, he was able to draw the layout of the staircase, the apartment it led to, and describe the cat to his mother. And she told him that they had once lived in that exact building, with the same staircase and apartment layout. And they had lived there with someone who owned a white cat. Not such a crazy story, until you realize that he and his mother moved out of that apartment when he was just 14 months old. This begs the question, are all of our memories still in there, even the ones we've forgotten? When we die, do we get to see everything that we thought we forgot during our time on this side of life? Is what is gone only temporary? One of the reasons death is scary to a lot of people is that it seems very lonely. You came into this world alone, but do we leave alone? Many people who have had near-death experiences explain that they saw a dead relative there to either escort them to the afterlife or tell them it wasn't their time yet. But whichever one it was, death was definitely not as lonely as we might think. Whether this was simply a figment of their imagination trying to reassure them and make them comfortable in their last few moments, or it was really the spirit or soul of their dead relatives is something we'll never be able to say for sure. However, what we do know is that death for most people is not lonely, or at least does not feel that way. Speaking of the soul, this is one concept that science has not been able to figure out yet, or at least have some kind of explanation for. But with the number of near-death experiences associated with an out-of-body experience, it might be time to start rethinking whether it's something that can even be explained by science. I once came across the story of a freshman in college who had just overdosed on sleeping meds. They flatlined in the ambulance and were declared legally dead for 3 minutes. However, they experienced everything in the ambulance, not from their own eyes, but from a third-person view, an out-of-body experience. What was striking was that they saw the EMT who was trying to resuscitate them in the ambulance. Minty green hair, so distinct you couldn't miss it. After they were stabilized at the hospital, 3 days later, they asked for this EMT. The EMT who they had seen while they were dead was a real person. The out-of-body experience they had while in the ambulance was filled with real memories of them lying down on the ambulance floor, machines beating, and EMT struggling to bring them back. You hear things like this and you have to pause and wonder, do we really not have a soul, whatever that may be? Are we literally just made of random atoms and molecules responding to stimuli that Mother Nature throws at us? Or perhaps are we something more? These are the stories and experiences of the people who have managed to escape the permanence of death and have battle scars to show for it. However, for most, what is death remains dead. And so around 1 to 2 weeks later, it's time to say our final goodbyes. Much of what we know about human history is down to how we've buried our dead. From tombs to mummies, dead people have given us more information than the living left behind. The oldest known international burial site dates to around 10,000 years ago in Kafsa, Israel. The remains of the dead were put carefully in a coffin together with items such as garments, trinkets, and food, and these coffins were then placed carefully in a cave. There was also evidence in this cave that the living painted the remains of the dead, threw parties and great feasts to honor their passing, and people were buried in groups of families. This means that even as far back as 10,000 years ago, humanity understood the significance of death and the need to celebrate a life well spent. To date, many different cultures do funerals differently. Most people sit together to reminisce about the life once lived, talking about all the good the person did while they were alive. Many religious organizations pray over the remains to give them a favorable outcome in the afterlife. But what that afterlife is different for different people. Abrahamic religions believe that your actions on this earth determine where you spend eternity afterwards. Families are encouraged to be strong in the face of death, as we would all eventually be reconnected when we cross to the other side. For some other religions like Hindu, what is dead shall be reborn. After the ceremonies and prayers, the bodies are buried or cremated, and the living that are gathered disperse in a bid to heal from the hurt of losing someone. Even when we expect it, death is extremely painful, because the idea of losing someone isn't the same as actually losing them and mourning the relationship that it once was. Although we are fully aware that these things can happen and that they are part of the human experience, when we are faced with the harsh reality, the feeling of grief can be excruciating. The finality of death is its scariest attribute. The waking up one morning and realizing that everything we once had, shared, experienced, they're all gone forever. The fact that all we'll have of those experiences are memories. Old memories we cannot recreate, and new memories we cannot form. But more often than not, these experiences give us a new perspective on life. It reaffirms the reality of the brevity of life and gives us the courage to experience all that we can in the short time we have on this earth. It teaches us to be good people while we're alive, because we won't be there to defend ourselves when the eulogies are being read about us as we lie in an open casket. And in the end, we're better equipped to help people going through the same thing, because people are better comforted by others who have had a similar experience. Seeing someone just like you survive through their own loss gives you a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, you too will be able to pull through. When you're sitting there staring at your loved one who is about to die, understand that death is normally not as painful and troubling for the person dying as it is for you. For the next 2 hours, sit with them, squeeze their hand in yours, talk about all the beautiful things in life, about shared experiences, about their kids and pets, their lovers and friends. Talk about a life worth living till its last breath. Talk about a life well spent. Talk about death. The earth will keep spinning, the birds will keep chirping, but eventually, everything has an end. While right now it's true that everything does come to an end, it might not be for long. The average lifespan has been going up for years, and scientists are looking for ways to keep us alive for longer. The dream is that one day, we would never have to watch our loved ones die. But is immortality a dream or a nightmare? One day you're going to die, and that sucks. The truth is, you, me, and every other human on this planet have been marked for death since the minute we were born. But this is hardly news. Death is just the price we must pay for being alive, right? Although we've been socialized to accept death as an inevitability and live our lives knowing that its looming shadow will one day catch up with us, many of us might never really come to terms with it. Then, without warning, death snatches someone close to us, and we're forced to think about the frailty of our short and fragile existence and its unavoidable end. But as you likely have realized now, humans don't simply accept the hand they're dealt. Throughout our evolution as a species, we've come up with ideas, beliefs, and theories that attempt to shine a light deep into the cold, dark abyss of death, to give ourselves a hope of continued living, an everlasting existence. We've fought death, both mentally and physically, but so far, it is winning, still, and by a landslide. Around 90% of humans that have ever existed are dead. All hope isn't lost though. Thanks to advancements in technology, we now live longer, healthier lives. And if science and anti-aging efforts continue progressing, who knows? Maybe one day we might become immortal. The whole concept of immortality is almost ancient as that of death itself. We've been dreaming about living forever since we discovered that we most certainly won't. But depending on who you ask, immortality could mean different things. The most prominent and acceptable notion of immortality is that of the soul. While we still don't have a scientific definition of the soul or evidence that it even exists, spirit that lives on forever in the afterlife has been part of our teaching since ancient Egypt and Babylon, and to a certain extent, still remains a common belief among most people today. The premise is simple. While the body may wither and dissolve, the energy contained within our soul travels to another realm and continues living eternally. Death is not the end. It is merely the transfer of energy from the realm of the physical to that of the spiritual. But what about an immortal body, or in other words, biological immortality? Advancements in science and technology have been successful in increasing life expectancy dramatically over the decades. Since the Age of Enlightenment, the human lifespan has also been on the rise. In the past 60 years, it has increased from around 52 to 72 years. It's also expected to keep rising as we develop more cures for terminal diseases and come closer to reversing the effects of the biggest obstacle on our road to immortality: aging. As we grow older, we lose our strength, mobility, and senses, our main survival characteristics. This process of deterioration with age is known as senescence, and it might be the only thing stopping us from reaching immortality. Well, once we've found cures to all our terminal illnesses as well. While senescence is a phenomenon observed in most species, a few don't have it, meaning that as they grow older, they don't show the sign of any loss of these survival characteristics. Lobsters can reportedly live over 100 years, the Aldebaran giant tortoise 255 years, and the Greenland shark over 400 years. Why nature has selected these species, and a handful of others, to display negligible senescence is still an evolutionary mystery, but their existence could be key to increasing our life expectancy in the future. Although these animals live really long lives, they're still not technically immortal. To see what that might be like, we have to turn to the freshwater polyps called hydra. Hydras are small, jelly-like invertebrates with a remarkable approach to aging. They are largely made up of stem cells that are constantly dividing to make new cells while discarding the old ones. This constant flux of new cells allows hydras to rejuvenate and remain forever young, making them potentially immortal. This does not make them unkillable, but it does mean that they do not experience any form of debilitating aging or senescence. Humans also have stem cells that can repair and even regrow parts of our bodies, like our livers. But we're not like the hydra. Our complicated multicellular structure requires different types of cells to perform different functions, most of which aren't stem cells. Sadly, as those cells age, so do we. So the question now is, can we stop these cells from aging? The science isn't certain yet, but some scientists hypothesize that we can engineer negligible senescence by repairing the damage that aging causes. This is the basis of SENS, the strategies for engineered negligible senescence. There are also some scientists who have recorded promising results with another approach called partial cellular reprogramming. In 2006, a study by Drs. Kazutoshi and Shinya Yamanaka showed that controlling just 4 master genes, it was possible to reprogram cells. Then in 2011, a team of French researchers first reported cellular rejuvenation using these 4 master genes, and were successful in reversing the effects of aging in single cells. While this is definitely an accomplishment, it only worked on isolated cells in a dish, so more testing and development in the field is needed before we can finally declare ourselves conquerors of death, or at least aging. With the exponential leaps we've been taking forward in both science and technology, experts predicted that our life expectancy is only going to keep rising, and who knows, maybe in a not-so-distant future, we'll be able to reach negligible senescence and increase our life expectancy to over 200, 500, or maybe even 1,000 years. Immortality could be well within the grasp of humankind sooner than we might think. But is this something we really want to do? If you could, would you want to be immortal? In the finale of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the film's villain, Walter Donovan, is desperate for eternal life and must choose from a table laid out of many false grails. He chooses foolishly, and instead of receiving the gift of immortality, he ages rapidly instead, and eventually turns into a skeleton that collapses to dust. The equally nefarious Dr. Elsa Schneider tries to remove the grail as well, and ends up falling to her demise. These characters' motivation for immortality was so great that they were willing to die for it, as ironic as that may seem. Even after the knight who guards the grail warned them that the cost of living forever meant they would have to live all their days in that one temple. The allure of eternal living is tempting, for sure. If nothing else comes of it, it could at least provide an escape from the cold and relentless grasp of death and save us from the unknown of the afterlife. But more than escaping death, living forever also means we'll get to experience everything, and watch the universe unfold in front of our very eyes. We'll have endless time to spend with our loved ones, and we'll be able to learn skills and pursue all of our passions, in a way we never could in a finite existence. When you look at it like that, immortality seems amazing. But when you look through rose-colored lenses, red flags appear white. You see, the clutch of immortality is, well, eternal. And eternity is a long time. The first problem that immortality would pose is the disruption of the natural order. While we may not exhibit senescence, the world around us would. And as death is an essential part of any healthy ecosystem, our continued, never-ending existence would disrupt the natural flow of the world. Earth would no longer be able to sustain our growing legion of immortal humans, and its resources would eventually dry up, forcing us to relocate to other planets destined to have the same fate as Earth the moment we set foot on them. This scarcity of resources, which to an extent we're already facing in our world today, will only add to the social divide between classes and end up making the rich even richer and the poor even hopelessly poorer. Any society ruled by a system of classes is bound to experience social rifts, but a never-ending time that sees no reshuffling of power even after generations could lead to ceaseless struggles culminating in wars and revolutions that could thrust humanity into a vicious cycle of endless dystopian living. It's not even the whole story. Let's say Earth can sufficiently provide for our universal existence and we somehow manage to stave off social dilemmas that are bound to arise with the passage of time. Will our lives at an individual level have any meaning? What motivations will we have to chase our dreams, to create, to achieve? Think about it for a second. Would we really go in search of our purpose if life had no expiration date? Immortality has the potential to change our fundamental views on relationships as well. What would it mean for monogamy if we can actually live forever? Would the notion of happily ever after and together forever still be as romantic when death isn't an option? The search for the one could easily become the search for the one right now, as people begin gravitating towards not getting married at all. Or our society becoming a lot more comfortable with the idea of multiple marriages throughout a lifetime, knowing that spending eternity with one person is harrowing no matter how much you love them. Family and children would also be affected by being immortal. The idea of bringing children into the world itself is an attempt at immortality through the continuation of a legacy. What incentive would people have to bring children when they themselves can live forever? Would there be a sense of urgency to procreate and extend our family lineages? Immortality would force generations to think twice before bringing their offspring into the world, and younger generations would find it difficult to succeed their parents and grandparents in society because the absence of senescence means the old will have the experience and the energy. How would the young ever thrive? Death is a healthy and natural phenomenon that is an essential part of nature, as much as we may hate it. Knowing that our time here on Earth is finite provides us with a sense of urgency that adds value and meaning to life. Taking risks to better our lives, following our sense of adventure, and knowing that all this will end one day adds immeasurable value to our existence that immortality could strip away rather ruthlessly. In his essay The Macropoulos Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Morality, The philosopher Bernard Williams compared living forever to being trapped at a never-ending cocktail party. The party might be interesting and fun to begin with, but soon enough it would become tedious and boring, especially if it were inescapable. Williams argued that we need new experiences in order to have reasons to keep on going. But after enough time has passed, we would have experienced everything that we would find stimulating. And once we get to that stage, what's the point in living anymore? Pop culture, literature, philosophy, and psychology are filled with anecdotes warning us against the curse of immortality. But why do we keep on needing to be reminded? And why are our best scientists still working on prolonging our lives and bringing us closer to the eternal biological living? At its core, our desire to be immortal stems from our fear of death, all of which Hollywood could create an endless score of movies warning us against. But the reason we keep searching is that deep down, many of us don't want to live forever. We simply don't want to die. The fear of death is simply ingrained into our psyches, and perhaps a part of it comes from the feeling that our life is being taken away from us. The harsh reality is death either comes too soon or in the prime of our lives, or too late when we're withering away in a hospital bed. Because of this, death seems more like a personal attack on our own agency, creeping up on us without our consent and robbing us of our most prized possession, our life. This lack of control brings about an understandable reason for our desire to be immortal. Maybe what we're seeking isn't an eternal life where death is a mere afterthought or a mythical creation of our imagination. Maybe what we truly desire is to control when we ourselves choose to die. Let us die young, or let us live forever. Whether science can bring us closer to achieving negligible senescence and living a life free from our current understandable fear of death, there is one thing that will always remain true in our finite existence. It is the brevity of our life that ultimately gives us agency to pursue our goals and achieve them. Mortality is an excellent motivator, and it's the reason our lives have individual meaning. Life is short is one of our most overused cliches, yet as tacky as it sounds, it incites some sort of urgency in us, a profound contemplation on our limited, finite time on this planet. And there's something magical about knowing that we won't exist forever. Who knows? Maybe chasing an immortal existence is what will ultimately strip us of the true meaning of being alive. And maybe our grim notion of death and its inevitability aren't as bleak as we always make them out to be. After all, there are far worse fates than death.